The wind came across the Wyoming plains in long, restless breaths, pushing dust into the seams of every fence post and carrying the smell of sage into the hollows of the Avery ranch. Colt Avery stood at the edge of his porch with his hat tilted low, one boot hooked on the rail, his eyes stretched toward the horizon where his cattle moved like dark flecks against the pale morning light. His land spread wide in every direction, near endless, a kingdom carved by sweat and silence. He owned more head than most men could manage, more acres than one man had a right to walk, and more coin tucked in the bank than he'd ever spend. Still, the people in town called him peculiar. They said it soft, when they thought he wasn't close enough to hear, but their voices carried all the same. A man like him, wealthy and built solid, ought to have a wife by now. Daughters of bankers had come, dressed in pressed muslin with ribbons in their hair, eyes hopeful beneath parasols. Widows of ranchers had carried pies and kind smiles to his door, offering hands that knew work and hearts that longed for shelter. Even the schoolteacher, with her neat handwriting and her voice steady as the church bell, had made excuses to ride past his gate. Colt turned them all away with a tip of his hat and a quiet word. Never cruel, but never inviting. At the mercantile, old men said he was waiting for the right one. Women said he was too proud for company. Others whispered darker, that something had broken him long ago and never mended. No one dared to ask him outright. Colt Avery wasn't the kind of man you questioned. He carried himself like the land itself, hard, unyielding, and bound by lines no one else could see. Every day he worked without complaint. He rose before the rooster, boots on before the first pale line of dawn split the sky, and walked the fence line with his rifle balanced easy in one hand. He tended the herd, checked the water troughs, mended what needed mending. His hands were scarred, not from a soft life of counting silver, but from rope burns, split wood, and winters that bit down to the bone. He lived honest with the land, and in return, the land yielded to him, steady and sure. But when the sun dipped low and the ranch hands drifted back to their bunks, Colt walked the yard alone. He ate alone, sitting at a table built for more than one, the lamp casting shadows that stretched too long across the walls. He sat by the fire at night with only the tick of the clock and the wind against the shutters for company. And though the bed upstairs was wide, no footsteps ever joined his on the stair. He did not explain himself to anyone. When folks asked why he turned away this girl or that, he only gave a slow shake of his head. No need, no rush, that was all. But in the quiet of the barn, with only the horses shifting in their stalls, his silence felt heavier. There had been someone once folks guessed that much. They saw it in the way his eyes fixed on nothing for too long, in the way he never lingered at barn dances or stood near the church after service. Something lost, something buried, haunted the corners of his gaze. So Colt Avery kept his silence and his land, refusing every offer that came his way. Out here, where the prairie stretched unbroken and the sky hung so wide it made a man feel small, he lived like the world owed him nothing more than the dirt beneath his boots. And maybe that was true. But even the wealthiest cowboy cannot keep ghosts for company forever. The land can hold a man steady, but it cannot hold him warm. And though Colt Avery would not say it, the silence in his house had begun to sound louder than the wind. The morning the trial began, the town of Red Hollow stirred with the kind of quiet that only came when everyone was waiting to see a life end. Dust hung in the air as wagon wheels ground over the rutted street, and men leaned against porch rails, chewing tobacco and spitting dark into the dirt. The saloon doors flapped steady, though no one laughed inside, and even the blacksmith's hammer had fallen silent for the day. Nora Wren walked into that hush with her head down, her skirts patched so many times they looked more stitch than cloth, her boots cracked at the toe. She clutched the strap of her satchel until her knuckles whitened, moving through the street like a shadow folks wished they didn't have to see. The courthouse was nothing more than a clapboard room with benches lined up in rows, the air heavy with the smell of sweat and coal smoke. Men tipped their hats back to get a better look at her as she slipped through the door, their eyes lingering on the hollowness in her cheeks and the thin braid that fell loose against her shoulder. A woman with feathers on her bonnet sniffed as Nora passed, pulling her little boy closer as if poverty were catching. Nora sat in the back, folding her hands together in her lap, though they trembled against one another. Her brother sat up front, wrists bound, hair hanging lank over his eyes. He looked smaller than she remembered, shoulders hunched as though already carrying the rope they hadn't yet laid across his neck. The judge read the charges in a voice that carried more gravel than mercy cattle theft, second offense. The words fell like stones, one after another, until the last dropped with final weight. Sentenced to hang at dawn. The sound that left Nora's throat was soft but sharp enough that a few heads turned. She pressed her lips together, forcing it back down. She had known the verdict before the judge spoke it, but hearing it said aloud carved something deep and raw inside her. Her brother didn't look back. He just stared at the floorboards, as if by not meeting her eyes he could spare her from what came next. It was then she felt the weight of another gaze. Across the benches, set apart from the crowd, sat Colt Avery. His frame filled the chair like it was built for him alone, hat brim low, hands resting easy on his knees. He did not look at her the way the others did, not with pity, not with disdain. His eyes were steady, a kind of recognition in them that made her sit up straighter against her will. Nora held his stare longer than she meant to, until the murmur of voices rose again and the sheriff clapped a hand on her brother's shoulder to lead him out. When she blinked, Colt was still watching, calm as a man who had seen this all before. She didn't know why, but something in that gaze steadied the wild thrum in her chest. As the benches emptied, townsfolk spilled into the street to carry the news as though it were gossip instead of a death sentence. Nora lingered at the back until the room thinned. When she finally stepped outside, the air felt different, sharper, colder, like the world had shifted beneath her boots. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did little to keep out the chill. The townspeople parted around her with sidelong glances, muttering to themselves as though she were already a ghost. She kept walking, past the saloon, past the blacksmith, past the women who turned their faces away. She had nothing left in this world, not even the chance to grieve in private. Still, when she reached the edge of the street, she dared a glance back. Colt Avery was standing on the boardwalk now, arms crossed, hat shadowing his eyes, still watching her. For a moment, she thought of looking away, of slipping into the emptiness where no one could reach her. But something in his stance kept her still. His stare wasn't offering comfort, and it wasn't demanding anything either. It was simply there, solid, unshaken, as though he saw in her something the rest of the town had missed. Recognition. Nora lowered her chin and turned back toward the road that led out of town. The gallows would be built by morning, and her brother's name would hang with him. But her own steps still carried her forward. Somewhere behind her, Colt Avery's gaze lingered, and though she didn't yet understand why, the memory of it followed her longer than the sound of the judge's verdict. The morning after the hanging, the town of Red Hollow lay quieter than a churchyard. Folks went about their business with voices hushed, as if speaking too loud might stir the ghost that still hung in the gallows yard. Nora Wren left with nothing but the satchel slung across her shoulder, the seams straining from too many patches and too few possessions. Her boots scuffed the dirt road as she walked out of town, her shadow stretching long in the rising light. She did not look back. There was nothing in Red Hollow worth remembering, not for her. The prairie spread out before her, wide and merciless, the grass stiff with frost where the sun had yet to reach. She walked steady, though her stomach was hollow and her throat dry. She had buried her grief deep, the way a body buries roots beneath hard soil, because there was no use in showing sorrow to strangers. All that mattered now was finding a place where she would not be chased off like a stray dog. By the time she reached the split-rail fence that marked the Avery Ranch, her legs ached and her palms burned from clutching the satchel strap too tightly. She stopped at the edge of the pasture, where the sound of hammer against wood carried across the still air. Colt Avery was bent over a gatepost, sleeves rolled to his elbows, the sun catching on the sweat at his temples. He looked up when her shadow crossed the ground, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. Most men in his position would have sighed, already knowing the script. Poor girls came to his fence line often enough, asking for scraps of work, a corner of shelter, or a mercy that stretched no further than the end of a meal. He braced himself for the same. But Nora did not shift from one foot to the other, and she did not twist her hands in shame. She stood still, her chin lifted just enough to meet his gaze. "You need a wife or a witness?" she asked. The hammer stilled in his hand. For a moment, he wondered if he'd misheard. He lowered the tool slowly, his brows drawn, eyes fixed on hers. What was that? Her voice did not shake, though her hands were trembling where they held the satchel strap. Men with land need heirs, and someone to see their name written even when they're gone. I can't give you stock or silver, but I can give you my word, and my hands. The words settled between them heavier than any silence. Colt straightened, his height casting a long shadow over the gate, and studied her face. She wasn't pretty in the polished way bankers' daughters were, but there was something carved into her features, something he recognized from long nights alone when the land pressed on a man and refused to let him breathe. "You're bold," he said at last, his tone caught between curiosity and disbelief. "I don't have the luxury of being anything else," she replied. The wind tugged at her braid, pulled at the frayed hem of her skirt. She stood without flinching, though her heart was beating hard enough that she thought he must hear it. She had gambled the last of her pride on that question, and now all she could do was hold steady. Colt set the hammer on the fence rail, his eyes never leaving hers. He was a man who could turn away any suitor, who had refused every polished offering laid at his door. Yet something in this girl's bluntness unsettled him. She was not begging, she was not pleading, she was offering a truth stripped of softness, and he could not recall the last time anyone had spoken to him like that. For the first time in years, Colt Avery did not know what to say. Nora Wren, with nothing but a satchel and a straight spine, had left him without words. And in the silence that followed, both of them understood that something had already shifted on that stretch of fence line, though neither yet knew what it meant. The air inside the Avery house held the warmth of a fire that had burned since before dawn, the smell of wood smoke mingling with the sharp scent of beef stew simmering low on the stove. Colt pushed the door open for her with no word, his hand steady against the frame. Nora stepped across the threshold, her boots leaving faint streaks of dust on the clean floorboards. She kept her satchel close, as if someone might yet try to strip it from her, though there was nothing inside worth stealing. Colt motioned to the table, broad and scarred from years of use, its surface etched with knife marks and the faint burns of hot pans set down too quick. She sat, spine straight, eyes fixed forward, while he ladled stew into two bowls and set a heel of bread between them. He sat across from her, his movements measured, his silence as heavy as the walls around them. Nora ate carefully, spoon steady in her hand, though each mouthful was the first warm food she'd had in days. She did not thank him. Gratitude carried a debt she couldn't afford. Instead, she let the quiet stretch until it seemed he meant to wait her out. Finally, she lifted her chin and spoke. "I'll say it plain so you don't mistake me. I've got no illusions about what I am, and I'm not here to be courted. I don't have a dowry, or fine dresses tucked away, or a laugh sweet enough to make you forget the cold." She set her spoon down, the metal clinking against the bowl. "What I have is my work, my loyalty, and if you give me a place, a name that won't vanish when the wind blows." Colt leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat, which he had not bothered to remove indoors. He studied her in the same way he might judge a horse brought to auction, not with cruelty, but with a quiet calculation. The silence stretched long, so long she could hear the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the soft whistle of wind through the eaves. Most people filled such silence with nervous words. She didn't. Her hands stayed folded on the table, knuckles rough and scarred from work, her shoulders square as though she'd nailed them into place. He waited for her to falter, to drop her gaze, to show a crack. She didn't give him that satisfaction. Colt reached for his bread, tore off a piece, and chewed with deliberate slowness before setting it back down. "You speak bold for someone with nothing in her pocket," he said at last. She met his eyes. "Because bold's all I've got left." The corners of his mouth twitched, not into a smile, but into something close to it. He picked up his spoon again, ate a few more bites, and then pushed the bowl away. His gaze settled heavy on her, steady enough that most would squirm under it. She stayed as she was, breathing even, her back unbent. At length, he spoke, his voice quiet but certain. "There's a bunkhouse by the barn. It's dry, and the stove works if you feed it. You can stay there while I decide." The words landed not as charity but as terms, plain and unvarnished. Nora inclined her head once, the gesture small but sure. She had not won him, not yet. But she had not been turned away either. That, in her world, was the first breath of something that might hold. Colt rose from the table, collecting the bowls with the same steady care he'd shown in everything else. He did not look at her again as he carried them to the sink, but the silence between them had shifted. It no longer pressed like a weight meant to crush her. It held like ground that, though hard, might one day be broken for planting. Nora sat a moment longer, her satchel resting against her boot, before she stood and followed him to the door. The bunkhouse waited. And with it, perhaps, the first chance she'd had in years to stop running. The first mornings in the bunkhouse were cold, the stove reluctant to hold its fire until Nora learned the trick of laying heavier wood across the kindling before dawn. She rose earlier than the hired men, braiding her hair back tight, sleeves rolled past her elbows as she carried buckets from the well. The handles cut into her palms, but she did not loosen her grip. By the time the ranch hands staggered from their bunks, rubbing sleep from their eyes, the stock had water, the hens were fed, and smoke curled steady from the cookhouse chimney. Work did not soften her. She was small and narrow-hipped, but she moved with the determination of someone who understood that idleness was a luxury reserved for other lives. When the fence tore loose in the wind, she held the rails while one of the men drove nails through, her hands blistering beneath the hammer's shake. When shirts split at the seams, she sat cross-legged on the porch mending them, stitches even and tight, her jaw set. By sundown her body ached, but she did not falter. The men watched her at first with curiosity, then with a grudging respect. They had seen women come and go, cook for a few weeks, take in laundry, or tend to chickens until they found better shelter. But Nora didn't work like someone biding her time. She worked like someone carving her place into the land with her own hands. She never asked for help, never lingered long in the doorway of the main house hoping for comfort, and never cast glances toward Colt the way others had. She kept her eyes on the work, as if the work itself was the only thing keeping her upright. Colt watched her too, though from a distance. From the porch or the pasture's edge, he measured the set of her shoulders, the way she carried more weight than her frame seemed to allow, the way she kept her silence without bitterness. He noticed how the children of a neighbor wandering too close to the fence one afternoon were met not with harsh words, but with a quiet hand guiding them back. He noticed how her lips pressed thin when she thought no one was looking, as if she was holding something sharp inside that she refused to spill. That night, when the day's work had been laid to rest, and the sky burned orange over the ridge, Nora came into the main house with flour dust on her dress, and her fingers raw from stitching. The men had eaten already, their voices carrying low across the yard as they played cards. Colt sat at the head of the long table, a plate before him, the lamplight cutting deep shadows across his face. Nora set down her own plate without waiting to be invited, folding herself into the chair opposite him. She ate in silence, as she always did, neither hurried nor slow, each bite taken with steady purpose. When the bowls were scraped near empty, Colt leaned back, his chair groaning beneath his weight. His eyes stayed fixed on her, unblinking, until the room seemed to still around them. "You've proven your worth here," he said finally, his voice even. carrying no praise and no dismissal, just fact. Nora did not look down, did not shift in her chair. She placed her spoon on the table, her hand resting beside it. "Worth ain't the question," she answered, her voice low but steady. Her eyes met his without flinch, the lamplight catching the edge of their defiance. "It's whether you want a wife or a witness." The words hung in the room heavier than smoke. Colt felt them settle somewhere he had not allowed anyone to touch in years, a place buried under work and silence and ghosts he did not name. He held her gaze, searching for hesitation, for the hint of a smile that might soften the sharpness of what she'd said. There was none. She had spoken plain, like a woman who had nothing left to lose and no reason to dress truth in ribbons. For the first time in a long while, Colt Avery felt something stir against the quiet he had built around himself. It was not comfort, not pity, but the raw edge of recognition. She was not asking for a place at his table, she was declaring she could stand there, whether he wished it or not. He leaned forward slightly, the shadow of the lamp cutting deeper across his jaw. But he did not answer her then. He only nodded once, slow and deliberate, before rising to clear the bowls. Nora watched him move about the kitchen, her hands still folded on the table, her spine straight as a post. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was waiting, alive with something unspoken, something that pressed close like the first breath before a storm. The storm rolled in heavy from the west, the kind that swallows the horizon until sky and land blur into one gray wall. By the time the first drops hit, fat and cold, the wind was already lashing through the cottonwoods, snapping branches like kindling. Colt had been checking the tack when the clouds broke, and Nora, carrying a basket of mended linens from the line, was caught in the downpour before she made it halfway across the yard. They both broke for the barn, the rain chasing them, pounding the dirt into mud. Inside, the storm's roar filled the rafters, drowning out every sound but the restless shuffling of horses in their stalls. The lantern hanging from the center beam swung wildly in the draft, its flame guttering. Colt reached up to steady it, his fingers brushing the metal. Nora moved beside him, her own hand lifting without thought, settling firm over his. The flame held, steadied by the weight of them together. When he didn't pull away, she let her hand rest there, the heat of the lamp warming their joined skin. Colt drew in a slow breath, his shoulders tense beneath his damp shirt. "Storms like this," he said, his voice low and rough, "they don't unsettle me, not anymore, but they remind me." He left it there at first, like he expected her not to care. But she stood silent, her eyes fixed on him, steady as the horses waiting for calm. He shifted, the words scraping out as if they had been buried too long. "I was once set to marry. Her name was Lila, banker's daughter from over in Cheyenne. Pretty, fine, dressed, laughed too loud sometimes." He gave a small shake of his head. "She said she wanted ranch life, said she could manage the dust and the work. Then a railroad man came through with promises of city streets and gold-lined windows. She left before I could even carve our names together into the table my father built." The rain hammered harder against the roof, as if to press his words deeper into the wood and earth. Nora's face didn't change. She didn't look at him with pity, only with a stillness that made it easier for him to go on. "My mother's buried in the north pasture," he said after a pause, his tone softer now. "She wanted to be near the cottonwoods. I planted wildflowers there, but the wind tears them up every spring. My father, he never forgave me. Said I threw away a future in politics to live with dirt under my nails. We barely spoke by the time he died." The horses shifted again, one snorting, the sound sharp against the storm. Colt's jaw tightened, his eyes dropping to the lantern still glowing steady above them. "So I keep the land, I keep the cattle, and I keep my silence. It's all I've had left." Lightning split the sky, bright and violent, the crack of thunder following so close it rattled the boards. The lantern swayed again, and Nora reached up, covering his hand with hers once more. Her touch wasn't soft, but it was firm, grounding, as though she was anchoring him to the present moment, rather than the ghosts he carried. He looked down at her then, really looked, and for the first time in longer than he could name, he didn't feel the need to step back into his solitude. Her eyes held no judgment, no false comfort. Just presence, just steadiness. The storm roared, the rain poured in sheets, but inside the barn something shifted. Colt let her hand stay against his, the warmth of her skin bleeding through the rough edges of his own. He did not speak again, and neither did she. The silence between them was not the heavy, suffocating kind he had known for years. It was alive, fragile, and oddly certain all at once. When the thunder rolled farther away and the lantern's light steadied, Colt Avery realized that for the first time since he buried his mother, since he watched Lila ride away, since his father turned his back, he had let someone touch the part of him he thought no longer existed, and he hadn't pulled away. The sun sat high and white in the Wyoming sky when the crunch of hooves came down the lane. Dust lifted in slow spirals behind the sheriff's horse, carrying the sharp smell of sweat and leather with it. Colt was by the corral, rope in hand, when the lawman reined up. Nora had just come from the creek, skirts damp at the hem, a basket of washed clothes balanced against her hip. She paused when she saw the badge glint in the light, her shoulders stiffening like a deer caught out in the open. "Afternoon, Avery," the sheriff called, tipping his hat though his eyes carried no friendliness. "Heard word of rustlers working the valley. Couple herds driven off south toward the ridges. Thought you ought to know." Colt nodded once, the line of his jaw tight. "Appreciate it." The sheriff's gaze shifted past him, landing square on Nora. He let the silence stretch, his eyes narrowing as though he could see through the patches in her dress and the tired hollows in her face to the truth of her being. "Strays bring trouble," he said finally, his voice carrying just loud enough to cut through the quiet. "A girl with no family, no land, no name worth speaking, sometimes it ain't cattle that go missing." Nora's grip tightened on the basket, her knuckles paling against the woven edge. She didn't drop her eyes, though, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her bend. She only stood there, back straight, chin lifted, while the sheriff spat into the dust and tugged at his reins. Colt's shoulders shifted. He didn't speak, didn't curse the man as his blood urged him to, but the muscles in his neck corded like rope pulled too taut. The sheriff seemed to read enough in that silence, because after a moment he clicked his tongue and turned his horse. Dust swallowed him again as he rode back toward town, leaving only the sharp scent of tobacco and the faint echo of warning behind. Nora set the basket down on the porch steps with care, though her hands shook once it left her fingers. Colt came up from the corral, his boots slow on the dirt. She didn't look at him at first, only stared at the white shirts crumpled inside the basket, as though they might answer for her. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than usual, but it carried a weight that pressed heavy into the air. "Do you trust me?" He stopped a few feet away, the shadow of his hat cutting across his eyes. For a long moment he said nothing. The question seemed to hang between them like a rope pulled taut, waiting to snap. Then Colt turned, walked into the house, and returned with a rifle in hand. The wood was worn smooth with age, the metal dull from years of use. His father's rifle. Without a word he held it out to her. Nora blinked once, then reached for it. Her hands were steady now, no tremor as she curled her fingers around the stock and lifted it to her shoulder. The motion was practiced, sure, as if she had done it 100 times before, though no one had ever seen her with a gun. She sighted down the barrel, then lowered it again, the set of her mouth firm. Colt gave a single nod, and in that nod lay the answer he hadn't spoken aloud. That night, the sky cleared after sundown, stars burning sharp above the darkened prairie. The wind rattled the cottonwoods, but the cattle lay calm in the pasture, not a stir among them. Colt stood by the fence line with his lantern low, watching the herd breathe easy, his father's rifle resting now in Nora's hands, where she sat on the porch, eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the yard. Nothing troubled the ranch that night, not man nor beast, but something had shifted all the same. Colt no longer saw her as a stray at his gate. She had placed herself in the circle of his keeping, and he, without words, had let her stay there. The cattle slept undisturbed, and for the first time in years, so did he. The deal had been weeks in the making, a handshake arrangement with the ranchers down by Willow Creek to share grazing rights come spring. But when Colt rode in to finalize it, he found them already siding with another outfit, muttering excuses about needing a partner with steady roots. The words carried less to do with cattle, and more with the man himself. They wanted proof his ranch wasn't built on silence and shadows. Proof he was more than just one man holding too much land with no family to tie him down. By the time Colt returned, dust rising from his horse's hooves, word had already reached town. In the saloon, in the churchyard, outside the blacksmith shop, people whispered that Avery's wealth was built on pride too high to bend. No wife, no heirs, no one to soften the edges of his name. Some said his fortune was waiting to collapse the moment he was gone. Nora heard the whispers when she went into town for cloth and salt. She kept her eyes forward as she walked, her patched skirt brushing against boots that clicked sharp on the warped boardwalk. At the general store, the shelves smelled of kerosene and burlap. She chose what she needed quick, folding the bolt of fabric over one arm and placing the salt tin on the counter. Behind her, voices rose in a murmur. A woman stepped closer, the wife of a rancher whose family had more land than sense. Her dress was fine enough, the ribbons on her bonnet still bright despite the dust. She looked Nora over, eyes traveling down to the patches at her hem, then back up with a curl at the edge of her mouth. "So," the woman said, her tone sharp but coated with sweetness, "are you the new hired help at Avery's?" Funny, he never could keep a cook or a maid for long. The other women nearby chuckled low, as if the joke were well earned. Nora felt the heat rise in her chest, but she did not let it touch her face. She straightened her back, set the cloth carefully on the counter, and turned to the woman with a calm so cool it cut sharper than anger. "I'm his witness," she said, her voice level and clear enough that the whole store heard. "That's more than most can claim." The words rang in the silence that followed. The woman's smile faltered, her cheeks reddening as the others looked away, suddenly busy with jars of flour and bolts of thread. Nora turned back to her purchase, her hands steady as she counted out coins, not sparing another glance. Colt had walked in moments earlier, his boots soft on the planks, and caught the exchange as it unfolded. He stood at the back, arms crossed, watching the way Nora carried herself, not bowed, not apologizing, not shrinking from the weight of their judgment. Her words hung in the air like a brand pressed into wood, leaving their mark. When she turned and saw him, her expression didn't change. She passed him the cloth without comment, walking out into the sunlight, as if the matter were closed. But Colt stayed a moment longer, his eyes sweeping over the faces in the store, daring anyone to say different. No one met his gaze. As he stepped outside, he found Nora waiting, the fabric tucked under her arm. For the first time in years, pride stirred in his chest, sharp and unhidden. He adjusted the reins in his hand, his voice quiet, but carrying weight. "You said you were my witness." "I did," she answered, steady as before. He looked at her then, really looked, and the corners of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile but close enough to show something had changed. For the first time in longer than he cared to remember, Colt Avery felt less like a man alone against the land, and more like a man with proof living, breathing proof that his word did not stand by itself. When they rode back to the ranch, the sky stretched wide and clean above them, the prairie gold beneath the sun. And though nothing about the cattle or the fences had changed, Colt felt the ground beneath him steadier than it had been in years. The first true snow came hard, driving in from the north with a wind that cut through coats and rattled the shutters on the Avery house. Drifts piled high against the fence rails, the cattle bawling restless in the dark pasture, their shapes moving like shadows in the storm. Colt had spent half the night stomping through the drifts with a lantern, checking gates, laying out extra hay, and calling the herd closer to shelter. By the time he returned inside, boots rimed with ice, his shoulders were heavy with more than just snow. Nora had stoked the fire high, the flames throwing long shadows up the walls. She had her hands wrapped around a kettle of cider, steam curling against her face. When Colt stamped his boots clean and came inside, she poured without asking, the motion as steady as if she had always belonged in that kitchen. She set the mugs down on the table, one before him, one before herself, and took her seat across from him. For a while they drank in silence, the sound of the storm wrapping around the house like a living thing. Then Colt set his mug down, the scrape of it loud against the table, and lifted his eyes to her. His voice, when it came, was quieter than the wind but carried heavier. "You still willing," he asked, "to be more than witness?" Nora did not look away. She didn't fidget, didn't pause to weigh her answer. Her chin lifted, and she met his gaze, steady as the hearth fire. "I am." Colt leaned back, the faintest of relief cutting through the set of his jaw. "Then we won't wait for spring." He rose, pulled on his coat again, and when he stepped outside, the snow swallowed him whole. By dawn, the preacher arrived, his horse moving slow through the drifts, steam rising off its back. He came wrapped in a thick coat, the collar turned up, a small Bible tucked under his arm. Colt led him in, his own boots crunching on the frost that had crept beneath the porch boards. There was no gathering, no ribbons or lace, no neighbors crowding to watch. Just the crackle of the fire, the dog curled by the hearth, and the storm pressing cold against the windows. Nora stood tall in her patched dress, the one she had worn into town so many months ago, the seams mended by her own hand. Her hair was braided clean, her face bare, her chin high. She did not wear white, but she did not need to. The preacher spoke the words soft, his breath clouding in the chill air. Colt's hand wrapped around hers, calloused and warm, his grip certain. When the moment came to seal their vows, Colt reached into his pocket and pulled free a leather cord, its braid worn smooth with years. His voice lowered, meant only for her. "My mother braided this for my father before she died. He gave it to me when I left home. Now," his fingers tied it firm around her wrist, his eyes fixed on hers. "You've got my name, and I've got yours." Nora's throat tightened, but her eyes didn't waver. She let him bind the knot, the leather snug against her skin, and she lifted her free hand to cover his. "That's enough," she whispered, and the storm outside seemed to soften against the roof. When the preacher left, he took a jar of honey and a sack of flour as payment, tipping his hat before disappearing again into the white swirl. Colt closed the door behind him and turned back to Nora, who stood still by the fire, her wrist bound in leather, her gaze steady. The house was warm now, not just from the flames, but from something that filled the space between them. Colt stepped closer, his hand brushing hers once more, not out of uncertainty, but out of quiet certainty. Nora lifted her chin, the firelight painting her face, and for the first time in years, Colt Avery let himself breathe easy. They had no witnesses but the dog and the storm, yet it felt truer than any grand ceremony could have. In the silence that followed, husband and wife stood side by side, and for the first time, the Avery house did not echo with emptiness. It held. The thaw came slow, dripping off the eaves in steady rhythm until the drifts shrank back to the shaded hollows and the first green shoots pressed through the thawed earth. By spring, the land had softened and the ranch stirred with life again. Colts were foaled in the lower pasture, their legs long and unsteady. Calves bawled for their mothers, filling the air with sound that spoke of survival. The prairie grass rolled out wide and tender, and the creek, freed from ice, ran quick and clear along its bed. Nora moved through the season with a steadiness that matched the land. She planted herbs and beans in neat rows along the porch, her skirts brushing against the new shoots as she worked. She kneaded bread with sleeves rolled high, her hands strong from years of labor, and she hung wash on the line where the wind carried the clean scent across the yard. The ranch hands had taken to calling her Mrs. Avery, not with smirks or sideways glances, but with a respect that settled easy in their voices. She gave as much as she worked for, and in the give and take of the ranch, she had earned her place. Children from neighboring farms sometimes wandered close, their laughter carrying before their small hands curled around the rails of the Avery fence. Nora always had a basket of biscuits at the ready, warm or cold, and no child was turned away. They'd run back across the fields with crumbs on their lips and butter on their fingers, and their mothers would shake their heads, though their eyes softened. The Avery Ranch, folks came to learn, was not just a place of cattle and coin, but a place where no one left hungry. In town, the whispers had not died. Some still muttered that Colt Avery had lowered himself to marry a poor stray, a girl with patched skirts and no name worth carrying. Others claimed Nora had trapped him, that she'd taken advantage of a man too proud to seek better. But whispers carried less weight now. Each time they reached the edge of the Avery porch, they fell away against the glow of the lanterns that burned long after sunset, against the sight of Nora and Colt standing side by side, shoulders squared against the wide horizon. Colt rode the pastures as he always had, checking fence lines, counting heads, keeping his land in order. But now, when dusk fell and the sky turned the color of spilled honey across the hills, he returned to the porch where Nora already sat, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes following the slow fade of light. He lowered himself beside her, sometimes with a sigh, sometimes with silence, and they would watch the prairie burn gold together. He had thought once that a wife was a burden he couldn't shoulder, that the land and his ghosts were all the company he deserved. Suitors had come and gone, polished and eager, none of them able to quiet the emptiness in his chest. It wasn't a suitor he had needed at all. It was a witness, someone who would see the weight he carried without asking him to lay it down, someone who would speak his name not for what he owned, but for who he was. Nora leaned her head lightly against his shoulder as the sun slipped below the ridge, and Colt let the quiet fill him. The land was alive, the house was warm, and the woman beside him was not pity, not charity, but proof. Proof that his word and his life were worth seeing, worth staying for, worth witnessing.